Winter of 2024. The sleet screamed through the Seoul streets like a banshee's cry, claiming lives and breaking hearts. At the lonesome train station in the outskirts, a woman sat frozen on a wooden bench, her breath forming white clouds in the bitter air. She clutched a small leather bag containing everything she owned. A stethoscope, a faded photograph, and a heart full of dreams that seemed as cold as the night itself. What happened next would become the most talked about love story. From the Han River to the furthest borders, changing two lives forever and making history in a world that had forgotten how to care. The wind cut through the station like a knife through butter that December night. Samanta pulled her thin wool coat tighter around her shoulders, but it did little to keep out the cold. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago and her lips were turning blue. The last train north had left 3 hours past and the next wouldn't come until morning if the storm didn't block the tracks. Samanta had been a nurse back in the city working in the trauma center where she'd learned to tend wounds, deliver babies and comfort the dying. But when the scandal broke, when a high-ranking director tried to force himself on her and she'd fought back, nobody would believe her word against his. The hospital dismissed her and word spread through the medical community like wildfire. No respectable clinic would hire her, so she'd taken what little money she had and bought a ticket to the remote provinces, hoping to find work in a place desperate for anyone with medical knowledge. But her money had run out at this station, and the local inn had turned her away when she couldn't pay for another night. Now she sat on this hard bench watching her breath fog in the air, wondering if she'd freeze to death before dawn. Her small leather medical bag sat beside her, the only thing of value she owned, containing her tools, medicines and the few certificates that proved her training. The sound of a heavy engine on frozen ground made her look up. Through the swirling snow, she saw a figure approaching from a sleek black sedan. The man was tall, wearing a heavy designer coat and a scarf pulled high against the wind. As he drew closer, she could see his stride was that of a man of immense influence, and his clothes, though practical, were of the finest quality. He moved with the confident power of a man accustomed to having his way. When he pushed through the station door, a gust of wind and snow followed him inside. The year before the world knew her name, the city of Seoul was a battlefield of ice and illness. The winter outbreak of 2024 struck with a fury that mirrored the banshee's cry of the winds, claiming lives and breaking hearts in the crowded wards of the trauma center. Samanta stood at the center of the storm, a devoted nurse whose hands never wavered even as the exhaustion threatened to pull her under. While others turned away from the most desperate cases, she gave everything. Her sleep, her safety, and eventually her very last one to ensure a dying patient could find a moment of peace. She had once been the backbone of her unit, a healer who had left everything behind to care for others in towns that the rest of the world had forgotten. But fate turned against her with a cruelty that cut like a knife through butter. When the crisis peaked, the hospital's director sought to exploit the chaos, cornering her in a moment of vulnerability. Samanta did not hesitate. She fought back with the fire of a woman who valued her dignity above her position. The scandal broke like a sudden crack in frozen glass. Because he was a man of status and she was an outsider with only her word, nobody would believe her. The hospital dismissed her and word spread through the medical community like wildfire, blacklisting her from every respectable clinic in the province. The descent into poverty was swift and unforgiving. She had spent her last savings on medicine for those who couldn't afford it, believing that her skills would always provide a way. Now the city she had served looked at her as if she were invisible. Her small leather medical bag, containing her surgical tools and the certificates that proved her training, became her only anchor in a world that had moved on without her. She watched her dreams grow as cold as the December night itself as the boarding houses turned her away, one by one when her pockets came up empty. By the time she reached the outskirts, she was a shadow of the woman who had once commanded the trauma ward. The wind howled through the narrow alleys, mocking the thin wool coat she pulled tighter around her numb shoulders. She had traveled to this remote station hoping for a fresh start, but the money had run out just as the sleet began to scream across the tracks. Now she sat on a hard wooden bench, watching the white clouds of her breath fade into the bitter air, wondering if the dawn would ever come. She clutched her bag, the weight of her stolen career pressing against her chest, as she waited for a miracle that felt a lifetime away. The sound of a heavy engine on frozen ground broke through the silence of the remote station, heralding an arrival that would change history. Through the swirling snow, a sleek black sedan pulled to a halt, its polished surface reflecting the dim, flickering lights of the platform. The man who emerged was a figure of immense influence, a Korean business leader known for a discipline so rigid it seemed to rival the winter's own bite. Woo-jin stepped into the bitter air, his life ruled by schedules and the weight of decisions that affected thousands. Yet tonight, the urgent business that drove him was about to collide with a destiny he had never planned for. He moved with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his way, his heavy designer coat and fine leather boots marking him as a king in this untamed, frozen territory. As he pushed through the station door, a gust of wind and snow followed him inside, but it was the sight on the wooden bench that made his breath catch. He noticed her then, a woman curled against the cold, her strength fading but her dignity remaining like a silent fortress. Woo-jin was a man of power and emotional distance, yet something about her stillness, her quiet fight against the freezing night, made him pause in a way no business merger ever could. It wasn't pity that stirred within his chest as he looked at Samanta. It was recognition. He saw in her the same iron-willed survival that had built his own empire, a soul that refused to be broken even when the world had turned its back. His discipline, usually an unbreakable shield, began to crack under the weight of her presence. He studied her with concerned eyes, noting the small leather medical bag clutched in her lap, the only thing of value she owned. Her lips were turning blue and her fingers had gone numb hours ago, yet she did not beg. Woo-jin approached cautiously, the silence of the station magnifying the sound of his expensive leather boots on the hard floor. He saw the white clouds of her breath forming in the air, a sign of a life hanging by a thread, and for a man who lived by logic, the sudden urge to protect her was a storm he couldn't block out. In that moment, the schedules and the urgent business faded into the howling wind, leaving only two lives that refused to pass each other by. The wind cut through the station like a knife through butter that December night, mocking the thin wool coat that offered Samanta no refuge from the biting sleet. As Woo-jin stood before her, the sheer power of his presence seemed to fill the lonesome station, his shadow falling long across the wooden bench where she sat frozen. He did not speak immediately, his concerned eyes studying the way she clutched her medical bag, a heart full of dreams that seemed as cold as the night itself. With a movement that was both deliberate and surprisingly gentle, he began to shrug out of his heavy designer coat, the fine fabric whispering against the howl of the storm. "Evening, miss," he said, his voice deep and warm, breaking through the silence that had threatened to claim her. "Mighty cold night to be sitting out here alone." He held the coat out to her, an offering of life in a place that smelled only of frozen iron and desperation. But Samanta's chin came up defiantly, her intense pride holding her together more than warmth ever could. She looked at the expensive garment and then at the man accustomed to having his way, her teeth chattering too hard for easy words. I am fine," she managed to say, the lie forming white clouds in the bitter air. She had learned back in the city that help from powerful men often came with a price she wasn't willing to pay, and she wouldn't let her desperate situation turn her into a woman of questionable virtue. She tried to pull her thin shawl tighter, but her fingers had gone numb hours ago, and her strength was visibly fading. Woo-jin did not pull away. Instead he stepped closer, his own breath fogging in the air as he watched her quiet fight against the cold. "Miss, you're going to freeze to death if you stay here much longer," he said, his voice filled with a firm concern that left no room for argument. He did not wait for her permission this time, stepping forward to wrap the heavy coat around her shoulders. The warmth of it, still carrying his body heat, made her gasp with relief as the scent of pine soap and fine leather enveloped her. For a moment, the confrontation of her pride wavered against the reality of her exhaustion. She looked up into his honest eyes and saw a kindness she hadn't seen in far too long, a recognition of her dignity rather than a look of pity. As the heat began to seep into her stiff limbs, making her fingers tingle painfully, the spark of electricity passed between them. "Libby," Samanta finally let her shivering hands settle into the plush lining of the coat, accepting the help of the stranger who had paused his urgent life to keep her from the grave. For the first time in months, as she sat pressed against the warmth of his offering, she felt safe. The storm's fury did not abate, but inside the warmth of the black sedan, the world seemed to shift on its axis, moving from a desperate fight for survival to a destiny that would be told for generations. Woo-jin sat in the silence of the plush interior, his life of schedules and cold business decisions momentarily suspended as he looked at the woman beside him. He was a man of immense power, but tonight his greatest act of influence would not be a corporate merger, but the restoration of a life that the world had sought to throw away. As the car glided through the pristine white snow toward the city, he reached for his phone, his voice deep and warm as he began to dismantle the walls that had kept Samanta from her calling. "I need the best suite at the Grand Sol and a private physician to meet us there," he ordered, his words carrying the weight of a man accustomed to having his way. Samanta watched him, her lips no longer blue but her heart still wary of the kindness of a stranger. She clutched her small leather medical bag, the only thing of value she owned, containing the surgical tools and certificates that proved her training. Woo-jin noticed her grip and turned to her with honest eyes. "Your medical skills are rarer than gold in this climate, Miss Montgomery, Samanta," he said firmly. "The scandal in Philadelphia, in the city, it means nothing here. Out here we judge people by what they do, not by the lies told about them." By the time the sun rose over the snow-covered mountains, Woo-jin had already set a new direction in motion. He did not merely offer her charity. He offered her a position as the lead nurse for his private foundation's medical initiative. It was a path back to the White Halls where she belonged, with good pay, comfortable quarters, and all the supplies she would need to heal the dying and comfort the broken. "I've been looking for someone special," he admitted as they reached the sanctuary of the hotel, "someone with the strength and courage to fight back rather than let the world take." Samanta looked at him with a mixture of hope and weariness, feeling a spark of electricity pass between them as she realized this job might be more complicated than she'd thought. She had been freezing and penniless at a lonesome station only hours past, but now she had a home and the respect of a man who treated her as an equal while still being protective. As she stepped into the safe haven he had secured, she realized that everything that had happened before was just preparing her for this moment. For the first time since the winter outbreak had claimed her life, Samanta was looking forward to the future with a heart full of dreams that were no longer cold. The morning sun streamed through the towering glass windows of the Metropolitan Hospital, leaving the world outside covered in pristine white snow that mirrored the sterile brilliance of the corridors. Samanta walked through the white halls with a quiet determination, her heart full of dreams that had finally begun to thaw in the warmth of her new reality. She wore a crisp new uniform that Woo-jin had ordered specially, and though she carried herself with the bearing of an educated woman, she could feel the weight of every head turning in the lobby as she passed. Word of her arrival had spread through the medical community like wildfire, and the whispers followed her like a banshee's cry echoing through the polished wards. "That's her," a young intern muttered to a group of nurses, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and undisguised envy. "The one the chairman himself brought in from the storm." Samanta kept her gaze forward, her fingers no longer numb but her mind acutely aware of the whispers regarding her mysterious benefactor. To the staff, she was a scandal in the making, a woman of questionable virtue who had somehow captured the attention of a man known for his discipline and emotional distance. They did not see the years of training or the certificates that proved her expertise. They only saw the shadow of Woo-jin's power protecting her. As she reached the trauma ward, the atmosphere was thick with tension, as heavy and cold as the December night she had left behind. The head of surgery, a man who reminded her far too much of the cowards she had fought back against in her past, studied her with honest eyes that held a hint of a sneer. "Mr. Woo-jin's word is law here," he said, his voice deep but lacking the warmth she had grown accustomed to. "But out here we judge people by what they do. A trained nurse is worth her weight in gold, but only if she can handle the pressure." Samanta met his gaze directly, her chin coming up defiantly just as it had on the lonesome train station bench. "I've learned to tend wounds and comfort the dying in places far worse than this," she replied, her voice strong and sure. She knew that her reputation was at stake once again, but this time she wasn't alone in the world. Deep within the hospital, she could feel the spark of electricity that Woo-jin's belief had ignited within her, a promise that their story was only just beginning to make history. As she adjusted her medical bag and stepped toward her first patient, she realized that everything that happened before was just preparing her to prove that she belonged in these halls, not because of a benefactor's influence, but because of the healer's soul that even the harshest winter could not break. The winter sun had begun to dip behind the mountains, painting the ward in gold and purple, but for the man in room 402, the world remained as cold as a banshee's cry. He was a grizzled laborer, his body broken by years of hard work and his heart hardened by the belief that he had been forgotten by a world that moved too fast. When Woo-jin arrived on his evening rounds, dressed in his finest black suit and moving with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his way, he found Samanta sitting by the man's bed. The patient was shouting, his voice rough with pain and anger, refusing the medicine and the help that Samanta offered with such quiet determination. Woo-jin paused at the door, his own life of schedules and decisions that affected thousands momentarily halted by the raw display of human suffering. He watched as Samanta did not pull away. Instead she leaned closer, her honest eyes meeting the patient's blazing gaze. "I've learned to comfort the dying in places far worse than this," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed to thaw the bitter air in the room. She spoke not as an employee, but as a healer who had once been alone and freezing at a lonesome station herself. With hands that were surprisingly gentle, she adjusted his blankets and spoke to him about his home, his dreams, and the life he had built with his own 2 hands. Slowly, the man's jaw loosened, and the anger that had flashed in his eyes was replaced by a mixture of hope and weariness. Woo-jin stood in the shadows, realizing that his wealth and influence had hidden this side of life from him, the desperate need for a kindness that money could never buy. He saw that Samanta was not just a trained nurse. She was a bridge to a humanity he had never allowed himself to fully feel. The spark of electricity between them grew stronger as their eyes met across the firelight of the small bedside lamp. "He was just lonely, Woo-jin," Samanta said later as they walked together through the white halls. "Loneliness in a city full of people is the hardest kind to bear." Woo-jin looked at her, his heart full of a respect that was fast becoming something more. He realized then that she was teaching him a lesson in humanity that was worth more than his father's fortune. Everything that had happened before, from the freezing night at the station to the whispers in the hall, was just preparing them for this shared strife. As the stars began to fill the sky, they stood together, 2 lives that refused to pass each other by. The night was a lonesome witness to the shadows that stretched through the executive office, where the city lights below glittered like cold diamonds against the black velvet of the Seoul sky. High above the white halls of the hospital, the wind howled against the glass with the banshee's cry of a winter that refused to relent. Samanta found Woo-jin standing by the window, his silhouette tall and imposing, yet he looked more like a man alone in the world than a business leader who moved the hearts of thousands. He had sent his staff home hours ago, his life usually ruled by schedules now falling into a heavy silence that made the air feel as thick as the December snow. "How is the patient?" he asked, not turning as she entered, his voice deep and warm but carrying a weariness she had never heard before. Samanta walked toward him, her own heart full of dreams that had finally found a place to rest. "He is sleeping," she replied softly, "dreaming of a world that isn't made of iron and glass." Woo-jin finally turned, his honest eyes studying her in the dim light. For a man who owned a 100,000-acre legacy and investments that spanned the West, he seemed suddenly stripped of his armor. "People see the power, Samanta," he said, his jaw tightening as he stared into the firelight of the small hearth in the corner. "They see the millionaire rancher, the CEO, who always has his way. But they don't see the isolation of being the only one who cannot afford to fail." He spoke of his father's fortune made in shipping before the war and the burden of keeping a dynasty alive while his own heart grew as cold as the Wyoming Territory. He admitted that he had been praying for someone like her to come along, a healer who didn't look at his wealth, but at the man beneath the heavy designer coat. "I've been lonely in cities full of people, Woo-jin," Samanta said, reaching over to squeeze his hand with a gentleness that made him gasp with relief. "I know what it's like to have the world watch you but never truly see you." In that moment, the spark of electricity between them was no longer just an attraction. It was a shared strength. They stood together against the dark, 2 lives that had been prepared by rejection and hardship to find sanctuary in each other. As the stars watched over them, the emotional distance that had ruled Woo-jin's world began to melt, replaced by a promise that they would face the coming storms together, forever and always. The spring gala in Seoul was a spectacle of wealth and power that felt as cold as a blizzard howling through the Wyoming Territory, claiming the warmth of the room and breaking hearts with every whispered judgment. Under the glittering chandeliers of the grand ballroom, Samanta stood beside Woo-jin, her ivory silk dress shimmering like the pristine white snow that had once threatened to claim her life. She carried herself with the bearing of an educated woman, Yet she could feel the weight of the corporate world's eyes, calculating and sharp like a knife through butter, as they dissected her presence. To the elite families gathered there, she was not a trained nurse or a healer. She was an outsider of questionable virtue, a scandal whispered about in the medical community like wildfire. Woo-jin's mother, a woman whose discipline and emotional distance were legendary, approached them with the confident stride of someone accustomed to having her way. Her eyes, though polite, were as bitter as the air at a lonesome train station. "My son has always been a man of investments and business," she said, her voice deep but lacking the warmth that Samanta had found in the firelight of the ranch, the CEO's private office. "We expected his partner to be a woman of high status, not a nurse from a charity hospital." The words hung in the air like white clouds of breath in a winter storm, intended to make Samanta feel as if she were still sitting on that hard wooden bench in Cheyenne. Woo-jin's jaw tightened and anger flashed in his honest eyes as he stepped protectively in front of Samanta. He was no longer the reclusive business leader who let schedules rule his life. He was a man who had found someone special, someone with the strength and courage to face challenges head-on. "Out here, mother, we judge people by what they do, not by the lies told about them back east, or the status of their birth," he said firmly, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled crowd. He took Samanta's hand and a spark of electricity passed between them, a shared strength that refused to be broken by the expectations of a world that didn't know their hearts. Despite the serious nature of the confrontation, Samanta felt her chin come up defiantly. She had learned to tend wounds and comfort the dying while facing far greater enemies than corporate gossip. She realized then that their love story was becoming something bigger than just personal happiness. It was a reinventing of themselves against the cold indifference of society. As they turned away from the whispers to dance slowly under the star-filled sky of the ballroom, Samanta knew that they would face anything together forever and always. The silence of the hospital night was shattered by a sound that mirrored the banshee's cry of the 1887 blizzard, claiming the peace of the halls and breaking hearts with the suddenness of a lightning strike. A massive accident at the construction site near the southern border of the city had sent a wave of wounded men toward the trauma ward, their lives hanging by a thread as thin as the shawl Samanta had once pulled around her numb shoulders. Among the chaos was a young laborer, his chest crushed and his breathing labored, the internal bleeding so obvious that even the senior surgeons hesitated, their faces pale with a worry that filled the room like a bitter draught. Through the swirling confusion of the emergency room, Samanta stepped forward, her heart full of dreams and a quiet determination that the coldness of the medical board could not block. "Clear a table," she ordered the gathered staff, her voice deep and warm but carrying the authority of a woman accustomed to being a healer in the untamed wilderness. The head of the medical board, a thin man who had often whispered about her status, looked at her with uncertain eyes, doubting her surgical abilities in the middle of such a storm. "Shouldn't we wait for the specialist?" he asked, his voice chattering like a man caught in the sleet. "He'll be dead before the specialist arrives," Samanta replied firmly, her fingers no longer numb but moving with the skilled hands of a woman who had performed miracles with a medical bag rarer than gold. For the next 3 hours, Samanta worked over the broken body, repairing internal damage and setting bones while the board watched in awed silence. She moved with a confident stride, her surgical tools and certificates of training finally finding their purpose in this lonesome fight for a life. When she finally stepped back, exhausted but triumphant, the young man's breathing was steady, and his color had improved beyond hope. "He'll live," she announced, and the ward erupted in cheers that echoed through the white halls like the music from a legendary celebration. Woo-jin, who had watched from the doorway with undisguised admiration, felt a spark of electricity pass through his heart as he saw her respect earned through honest work. The board members, once skeptical of a nurse from a charity hospital, now looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the territory. They realized that her word was as fine as any physician in Denver or Chicago, and her past no longer mattered in the face of such courage. As the stars watched over the city, Samanta realized that everything that had happened before, the freezing station, the whispers and the rejection, was just preparing her for this single act of kindness that would make history. The moonlight silvered the world through the hospital's towering windows, leaving the chaos of the emergency room behind and painting the white halls in a peaceful, pristine light. High above the city streets, the December wind still whispered like a banshee's cry, but inside the quiet of the lounge, The air was warm and heavy with a truth that had been building since that first night at the lonesome train station. Woo-jin sat across from Samanta, his honest eyes studying her exhausted but radiant face, and realized that his desire to protect her had transformed into something far deeper than a millionaire's act of charity. He had once been a man of emotional distance, his life ruled by schedules and the cold logic of business, but the woman sitting before him had brought a warmth into his life that he had never allowed himself to feel before. "You saved that boy's life tonight," he said, his voice deep and warm as he watched her hands, those skilled hands that were no longer numb from the bitter air. Samanta looked at him with a mixture of hope and weariness, her intense pride finally softening in the glow of their shared success. "It's what any trained nurse would have done," she replied modestly, but Woo-jin shook his head firmly. He saw now that he didn't just want to be her benefactor or the man who had rescued her from freezing. He needed her strength and her compassion to heal the parts of his own soul that had gone cold years ago. He leaned forward, the spark of electricity between them carrying clearly through the silent room. "I thought I was helping you find a place where your skills belonged," he admitted, his jaw tightening as he spoke from his heart. "But I realize now that I was the one who was lost, alone in a world of wealth and isolation." He looked at her not as a reclusive leader looking down at an outcast, but as a man who had found his equal, a healer who could confront the challenges of his world head-on. Everything that had happened before, the blizzard in the outskirts, the whispers of the medical community and the trial of her skills, was just preparing them for this moment of absolute honesty. For Woo-jin, it was no longer about pity or duty. It was about the realization that his life would be empty without her. As the stars watched over them, he knew that their love story was truly making history, proving that even a man accustomed to having his way could be humbled by a single act of kindness and a heart full of dreams. The summer air in Seoul held the promise of a new season, but the memory of the winter storm remained as a banshee's cry in the hearts of those who had nearly been claimed by its cold. Under the vast, starlit sky of the city, Samanta and Woo-jin stood together on the balcony of his estate, looking out toward the distant lights of the outskirts where their story had begun with chance and desperation. The world now saw them as a symbol of success and a love that made history, but for them the night at the lonesome train station was a fire that still burned with a quiet determination. They had found personal happiness, but as they watched the flickering lights of the poorer districts, they knew that their shared strength was meant for something far greater than themselves. "I can still feel the cold of that wooden bench," Samanta said softly, her honest eyes reflecting the moonlight as she leaned against the railing. "I think of the others who are sitting there tonight with $3 in their pockets and a medical bag they cannot use because the world has turned its back." Woo-jin looked at her, his jaw tightening with a smile of pure joy and a resolve that had been forged in the firelight of their first night. He was no longer just a man of influence ruled by schedules. He was a man who had discovered that the greatest treasures are found in the most unexpected places. "We won't just build hospitals for those who can pay," Woo-jin said, his voice deep and warm, carrying clearly in the night air. "We will build a foundation that reaches the lonesome corners of this territory, where healers like you are rarer than gold." They began to plan then, their conversation flowing like a legendary melody, envisioning clinics in the mining towns and schools for nurses who possessed the strength and courage to fight back. It was a vision inspired by a cold night and a quiet station, a seed of hope that would grow into a modern facility serving patients from hundreds of miles around. As they shook hands on their new mission, a spark of electricity passed between them, more powerful than any corporate merger or business deal. They were two people from different worlds who had decided to build a life together based on mutual respect and an unwavering commitment to those who had been forgotten. "Everything that happened before was just preparing us for this, Libby," Samanta whispered, her heart full of dreams that were now warm and safe. Under the big sky, they stood hand in hand, ready to prove that in a land of endless possibilities, a single act of kindness could indeed change history. The spring of 1889, modern Seoul, brought a chill that felt as bitter as the winter outbreak, claiming the peace of the boardroom and breaking hearts with the suddenness of a lightning strike. The corporate rivals of the Double T, the Woo-jin Group, had moved in the shadows, their intentions as cold as a banshee's cry. They had dug into the past, finding the old lies from Philadelphia, the city, and intended to use them like a knife through butter to ruin the reputation of the man who had dared to lead with his heart. The scandal broke across the financial news like wildfire, questioning Woo-jin's discipline and suggesting that his nurse was a woman of questionable virtue whose certificates were meaningless. "He's come to cause trouble," Samanta told Woo-jin as they sat in their private office, reading the headlines that sought to dismantle everything they had built together. The director from her past had arrived in the territory, claiming to investigate malpractice and moral turpitude, his calculated eyes filled with a permanent sneer. He believed that because she was a woman who had once sat freezing on a wooden bench, her word would never hold against his respected title. The corporate board grew nervous, their faces pale with a worry that the mysterious benefactor had made a decision that would cost the company its fortune. "Let him come," Woo-jin said grimly, his jaw tightening as he stepped protectively in front of his wife. "He'll find that things are different out here in our world." His honest eyes were blazing with an anger that no business rival had ever witnessed. He was no longer the man of emotional distance ruled by schedules. He was a citizen of a new dream, ready to fight for the healer who had saved his soul. The rivals demanded a hearing, hoping to see Samanta dismissed and Woo-jin's influence crushed under the weight of a fabricated shame. Samanta felt the familiar weight of the world's judgment, but she did not pull away. She looked at her medical bag, the heart full of dreams that had once been as cold as the night, and felt a spark of electricity pass between her and the man she loved. Everything that had happened before was just preparing them for this moment of absolute truth. They would go to the hearing not as a master and his ward, but as partners who had made history through a single act of kindness. As the stars watched over the city, they prepared to face the storm together, forever and always. The day of the hearing arrived like a blizzard howling through the territory, claiming the peace of the city and breaking hearts with the weight of 1,000 silent judgments. The courthouse in the center of Seoul was packed with reporters and corporate titans, their eyes as cold as the sleet that had once threatened to claim Samanta's life. The director stood before the assembly, his voice carrying the sneer of a man who believed a woman of questionable virtue could never withstand the power of his respected title. He spoke of moral turpitude and meaningless certificates, his calculated words cutting through the room like a knife through butter. But as the shadows of her past gathered to drown her, Woo-jin stepped forward with the confident stride of a man accustomed to having his way. "You want to question my wife's credentials?" Woo-jin's voice was deep and warm, but it carried a thunder that silenced the boardroom rivals. He looked at the medical board and the gathered elite, his honest eyes blazing with an anger that no business merger had ever provoked. He stood protectively in front of Samanta, publicly choosing the woman he had found freezing at a train station over the business standing his family had built for generations. "Out here we judge people by what they do, not by the lies told to protect cowards," he said firmly. The tide began to turn then, as patient after patient whom Samanta had treated in the White Halls came forward to testify. The young laborer whose life she had saved, the grizzled men from the mining districts, and the mothers whose children she had delivered all spoke of her skill and compassion. The doctor from the trauma center even testified that her surgical work was as fine as any in the nation. Under the scrutiny of such honest work, the director's accusations fell apart like thin ice in the spring sun. The judge's decision was swift and decisive, officially recognizing Samanta's right to practice medicine throughout the territory and ordering her accuser to leave their world immediately. The courtroom erupted in cheers that echoed like the music of a legendary celebration. Woo-jin swept Samanta into his arms, spinning her around as the flashbulbs captured a victory that would make history. "It's over," he whispered in her ear. "He can't hurt you anymore." Samanta looked into his eyes, her heart full of dreams that were no longer cold, realizing that by standing together, they had turned a public scandal into a testament to the power of love. As they walked out into the crisp air, they were no longer just a boss and his nurse. They were symbols of a reinvented world where a single act of kindness could overcome any obstacle. Years later, when historians wrote about the early days of the new territory, they always included the story of Woo-jin and Samanta Thornton, the legend of the millionaire and his nurse. The Samanta Woo-jin Foundation had grown from a seed of hope into a sprawling network of modern facilities, providing medical care to thousands from the crowded city centers to the furthest mountain borders. Their love story had indeed made history, inspiring countless others to believe that in a land of endless possibilities, two people from different worlds could build a life together based on shared dreams and unwavering commitment. As they stood together on the wide front porch of the main house, Watching their children play in the pristine white snow, Libby, Samanta, reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever regret it?" Woo-jin asked, as if reading her thoughts, his voice deep and warm with a smile that transformed his weathered features. He looked at the woman who had brought compassion and humanity into his life, realizing that finding her freezing at that lonesome station was the luckiest night of his life. "Never," Samanta said firmly, her honest eyes meeting his with a quiet determination that the years had only strengthened. She reached up to touch the beautiful gold locket he had fastened around her neck on their wedding night, the metal warm against her skin. Inside was a tiny photograph of the two of them, and engraved on the opposite side were the words that had become their truth. "Forever and always, JT." The real monument to their love wasn't in the hospitals or the town they had built, but in the hundreds of lives they had touched through a single act of kindness. In the museum in the city, visitors could still see Samanta's medical bag, the one she had clutched on that freezing night in 1887, next to a copy of their marriage certificate. The plaque read that their greatest adventures began when two lives refused to pass each other by. Outside their window, the wind whispered through the trees like a soft tune on a harmonica, carrying the sounds of a legacy that would inspire generations to come. As Woo-jin pulled her close, kissing her forehead under the star-filled sky, Samanta whispered that she loved him more than she ever thought possible. They were buried together decades later, hand in hand and heart to heart, their love story complete but their legend eternal. A love that made history.